Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And in this episode, I'm going to talk about the outbreak of war between China and Japan in 1937. And it was a moment that was, in some ways, in the hands of Chiang Shek, the Chinese nationalist leader, who looked at the future of Sino-Japanese relations on the encroachment that Japan had made into Manchuria and the pressure that Japan was putting for further territorial gain. And Chiang Kai-shek's view ultimately was that war would come sooner or later, and that finally China must make a stand. Chiang looked at the world situation. He looked at the civil war in Spain. He looked at Mussolini's ability to ignore the League of Nations and wage his war in Abyssinia. And he swiftly drew the conclusion that whatever stand that China took would be done alone, that there would be no international intervention to help China, that the League of Nations would be no use, and that Britain and France would do nothing, even though they had some of the biggest colonial liabilities, mainly Shanghai, that could potentially be lost in China. So the outlook isn't good. The Chinese nationalists had received some very good training from Germany, of all places. Both Weimar and Nazi Germany had trained Chinese troops, but the Chinese officer corps was still in development. It wasn't anywhere near big enough for the challenge that was coming. So today, once again, I'm looking at Rana Mitter's China's War with Japan, 1937 to 45, the struggle for survival. And we're going to look at the incident at Wanping that begins the war. Wanping does not look like the sort of place, writes Rana Mitter, where destinies of nations are decided. Even today, it's a remarkable village about 15 kilometres southwest of Beijing. Back in 1937, it was practically countryside. It does, however, have one impressive feature: a granite bridge decorated with the carved heads of nearly 500 stone lions, which drew the attention of Venetian traveller Marco Polo, who called it one of the finest bridges in the world. This endorsement gave it the name by which it is best known in the West, the Marco Polo Bridge. In China, it's known as Lugao Chao. In the summer of 1937, the area around Lugao Chao was heavily populated by rival troops. The Chinese 29th Army was under the command of local strongman Song Zhejuan. Also positioned nearby were soldiers of the Japanese North China Garrison Army. The Japanese were allowed to deploy their military in the area because of the agreements made after the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, permitting foreign powers to station troops that would protect them against another uprising. This relationship between the two sides was very uneasy, and Song himself was in a difficult position, caught between the government in Nanjing and the Japanese. Chiang's government wanted Song to refuse to cede any further ground to Japan, but at the same time not to provoke a diplomatic incident, and Song needed to compromise with the Japanese to preserve his own base of power. So a lot of the military forces that Chiang Kai-shek relied on were ruled by or led by military warlords around China. A lot of the manpower that would fight the war was loaned to the nationalist government by warlords. And so Chiang had to be quite careful, Chiang Kai-shek had to be quite careful with how he dealt with these warlords, and had to always be kind of holding them together in a sort of a coalition. And so he had to take into mind that often if Chiang didn't want Song to cede any territory, then he had to recognise that the position that the Chinese government, the nationalist government was in, was always one of asking. In July 1937, diplomats stationed in northern China sensed something in the air. Rumours had been current in Peiping during the past week of possible disorders being created by disgruntled Chinese or Japanese nationals, wrote the counselor in the US Embassy. The rumours seem primarily due to the uneasiness which has developed among local Chinese as a result of Song's lengthening absence. The councillor's judgment that General Song, which is what he meant, was away from the base because he was trying to avoid the Japanese, who wanted to pressure him into allowing them to dominate more of northern China. On the evening of the 7th of July, Japanese troops started firing in the area around Wanping. This was not surprising itself, as the foreign powers in northern China had been granted the right to carry out military manoeuvres when they chose, but this time the Japanese went further. The local Japanese commander declared that one of his men had gone missing and demanded entry to Wanping to search for him. The accusation was clear: the Chinese must have kidnapped or killed him. Over the past few years, the Japanese had become used to making demands of Chinese troops, and their orders were generally obeyed. But this time Song's troops refused, and low-level skirmishes broke out. So this was really, they refused really as a result of the encouragement of the nationalist government saying, you know, do not cede any territory. It seemed likely that they would die down again. Many such clashes had dissipated before, usually after the Chinese had made some concession. However, in distant central China, Chiang Kai-shek decided this was time for a different sort of response. So, after concession after concession after concession, the Wanping incident actually offered Chiang Kai-shek the opportunity to stop conceding, to make a stand, so that the Nationalist Army and the Nationalist Army's proxies in the kind of the warlord militias could actually begin a war that Chiang thought was probably necessary. Now here we're going to see some really revealing language by Chiang Kai-shek, which kind of gives a view into his beliefs about China and about nationhood and about how China should develop in the face of this threat. Ranamita writes, when he heard news of the fighting near Beijing, Chiang was not in Nanjing, but at the resort of Guling at Mount Lushan in Jiangxi province. Chiang used Lushan as a country retreat during the hot summer months, and throughout the 1930s, he invited his advisors there to plan for the future for a future war with Japan. By the summer of 1937, this preparation had become urgent. China has a responsibility to strengthen itself, he wrote in his diary. So here's the rhetoric. Only if we develop the psychology that having to fight is inevitable, may we perhaps avoid fighting. So Chiang, as a part of the kind of the Kuomintang, this National Revolutionary Party, which seized power in 1911, well, partially seized power in 1911, and existed in this kind of chaotic vacuum till about 1927. And again, and never really had full control over the entirety of the country at any one time, really. Chiang Kai-shek, like many nationalists going all the way back to the sort of the Italian nationalists of the 19th century, saw his role as kind of forging not just a physical territory, a physical territory of China, but really creating the people within it, creating a national spirit, a sense of patriotism, a willingness to fight and die for the continuance of the nation. That was where Chiang saw himself, saw his role. Chiang was meeting with his military council when he heard of the news that Song's troops had clashed with the Japanese. The dwarf bandits, it was his kind of slightly racist term for the Japanese, have attacked at Lugao Chao, he added in his diary, using the derogatory term for the Japanese that had first emerged in the imperial era. This is a time for the determination to fight. In his diary, Chiang also reflected on the meaning of the fighting at the Marco Polo Bridge. Is there going to be trouble for Song's Zhechuan? Are the Japanese trying to bring about independence for North China? He then added, more pensively still, is this the time to accept the challenge? So is this the moment that the war finally begins after concession after concession? At first, 3 of Song's senior officers cabled Nanjing, telling China that they could not comply with Japanese demands to withdraw from the bridge because of the consequences for national sovereignty. However, despite a show of defiance, the Chinese and Japanese local commanders at Wanping began to discuss a ceasefire. It seemed possible that the Marco Polo bridge skirmish would be resolved quickly. Chiang was confronted with a fateful question. Was the 2-day struggle really just a minor skirmish like so many before, or did it herald the start of another major Japanese assault on Chinese territory like the Manchurian crisis of 1931? If he decided that it was the former, then tensions would quickly cool. After all, North China was not really under nationalist control, but dominated by a patchwork of regimes run by Chiang's Chinese rivals and the Japanese military. By letting the fighting go, Chiang would not be immediately worse off, but if he decided the incident was more serious, a push by Japan to invade and occupy yet more of northern China, leaving the nationalist heartland in central China vulnerable, then Chiang had a grave decision to make, whether or not to declare war. The choice was not entirely Chiang's. Indeed, since the occupation of Manchuria, his options had been narrowing. As he received news in Lushan, he had to weigh up a complex range of factors, domestic and international, confronting him that hot July. First, and most immediately, it seemed like any compromise settlement would involve his government formally ceding control of the former capital. This was not like giving up Manchuria. The establishment of Manchukuo, which was the Japanese puppet state of Manchuria, had been a huge blow to China's prestige, but not a disaster. China had all but recognized the Japanese clan state by 1931. Beijing was a different matter. Under its former name of Beijing, the city had been a national capital for centuries. Although its political importance had waned, it was still a place of immense cultural and emotional significance for the Chinese. So if Chiang agreed to de-escalate at the Marco Polo bridge, what that would mean was that the Japanese would force Chinese troops to withdraw from the area. If they control that, then their route through to controlling Beijing itself is clear, and they can cut off any relief mission, any relief forces to the capital, and so you've effectively surrendered the capital if you lose the bridge and the surrounding area. Although its political importance had waned, it was still a place of immense cultural and emotional significance to many Chinese. The city had also had a strategic importance. It was the major rail interchange for northern China, connecting the north of China to the inland commercial city of Wuhan and allowing rail traffic to travel in all 4 directions of the compass. Previously, we've talked about the Paris Peace Conference and Japan's role and the interest that Paris that the Japanese had over controlling the Shandong Peninsula. Look at it on a map, see how close the Shandong Peninsula is to Beijing. And again, the Shandong Peninsula was a network of railways that connected to Beijing, and Beijing is another rail hub. You control those sorts of things and you can shut down northern China. This is obviously in the age before mass road travel, where railways are much more important at this point. Much more important. So, Rana Mehta writes, if Beijing fell under Japanese control, then an order from Tokyo could send thousands of troops from Korea and Manchukuo into the heart of the mainland. If Chiang surrendered the city, he would cede North China for a generation and put the nationalist heartland in great danger. Chiang recognised this in his diary on the 10th of July. This is the turning point for the existence or obliteration. Perhaps the coasts would have been occupied. I mean, here we go into the kind of counterfactual territory, colonised and assimilated by Japan, with maybe a kind of an interior of China as a kind of a rump colony, But this is the ultimate complete colonization of China. And Chiang was astute enough to see the significance of the bridge. If it were just Beijing, that would be one thing, but China feared that the city would be just one more conquest in an ever-lengthening list of Japanese provocations in China. Ever since 1931, the journalist Du Zhonghuan, as noted earlier, imprisoned for publishing anti-Japanese rhetoric in 1935, and his fellow exiles from occupied Manchuria had used their power in the press to argue that Chiang should be more active and launch a military campaign to recapture the northeast. Despite the rhetoric of 30 million compatriots under the iron hooves of the Japanese imperialism, Chiang had not changed his position on resistance. Although the Chinese public felt sympathy, Manchuria was simply too distant to rouse the sentiments of the wider population for an all-out war. Then, between 1933 and 1935, it seemed possible that Japan would be content with its gains so far, and that nationalist China could live, at least for a while, with Manchuria on its borders. It's very interesting from the point of exploring Chinese nationalism at the time. The idea that Manchuria is seen, or Manchuria is seen by many Chinese as, well, over there, almost like a different country, a thing that's far away from us, not a place that is inherently Chinese and full of Chinese people. Japanese, from 1935, Japanese influence in northern China had grown, and it had become clear that they regarded the entire region, not just Manchuria or Manchukuo, but the entire region as their own territory. Chiang was increasingly convinced that Japan would not rest until all China was a client state. If he did not confront them now, then the moment would surely have to come soon. And of course, the military thinking is, if you don't confront them now, the next time you confront them, you're in a weaker position. The influential Chinese paper Shenbao had published an editorial on the 9th of July starkly entitled "Yet Another Invasion," and warning, "This act is clearly a planned invasion action by the Japanese. This act is of a truly serious nature and should shock the world." Yet challenging Japan would be a highly risky venture, possibly a suicidal one. Chiang could expect very little support from the wider world, and the year 1937 was a grim one around the globe. In Europe, the political momentum appeared to be won with the dictatorships. Hitler's Nazi party had recreated Germany as a strong tyranny instead of a weak Weimar democracy that had collapsed in 1933. Mussolini's Italy likewise seemed orderly and powerful. Many observers ignored the violence and racism that underpinned these regimes to draw the conclusion that authoritarian government was the way of the future. And if you look at commentators in Great Britain and France who looked at Germany, even sort of people on the political centre right, looked at Germany and thought, well, that's kind of how these things are going to go, and whether we have that here is a moot point. But this is the future. The future is determined by strong men who, well, they seem to get things done. There is. Let's not write them off completely. So some fairly sympathetic editorials to them. Though obviously a huge number of press articles in Britain that were very critical of Nazism. In the USSR, writes Ranameter, Stalin's regime had turned its rage inward, and the country had been devastated by a series of purges against its own elites, leading to the execution or exile of millions of citizens, from top military leaders to ordinary school teachers. Although most of Europe remained in a sullen peace, the world was also riveted by the Spanish Civil War, in which the Republican forces of the elected government were battling the nationalist forces of General Franco. The Republicans relied on minimal assistance from the USSR, while Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy provided support for Franco. On the sidelines were the democracies, Britain and France, and Chiang could see clearly that they would be offering no help. Spain had already learned that the United States was in no mood for international intervention. Franklin Roosevelt had been re-elected president just a few months earlier, but had spent much of early 1937 engaging in a wounding and unsuccessful struggle to give him greater powers to challenge the composition of the US Supreme Court, while the Depression continued to haunt American life. To return to a war in Europe would be unpopular. To enter a conflict in China was close to unthinkable. So if Chiang wanted to fight back against Japan, he would have to do it on his own. He would also need to calculate how long China could last alone in a war against Japan. Chiang's hopes lay with his best troops, cabling his son Qing Kuo. Chiang told him not to worry about an invasion from Japan because he had the means to counter them. Chiang was referring to the troops trained by General Siegfried von Falkenhausen, his two German military advisors. It was certainly true that improvements had been made. However, Chiang's cable was laced with bravado. The reforms needed much longer to bed in, and the number of officers who had gone through training was still very small, only 30,000 in number. There are some kind of interesting parallels in terms of the kind of the race for military preparedness that we see today in the struggle in Ukraine. The problem that Chiang had is the problem that every commentator seemed to be able to identify during the 1930s, in that kind of one international pre-war system had collapsed. The world before the First World War, the world that was generally dominated by the British Empire. And a second functioning world order had yet to emerge. Some might argue that it has never emerged. But in that time, during the period of the 1930s, you have these challenger states looking to subvert the very, very shaky international order, and no one power, particularly politically or economically or militarily, able to step up and defend the rules-based system that was established in Paris in 1919. And this is something that immensely empowers Japan, gives Japan an immense deal of leeway. And Japan looked upon its actions in China and thought that this was not the concern of Europeans and not the concern of the international community. This was Japan asserting its rights to its own sphere of influence, or to establish its own sphere of colonial influence in China, and that in time the Chinese, like kind of children in the eyes of the Japanese, would be sort of educated in the ways of kind of Japanese modernity. Anyway, I'll be continuing this a little bit later on, so I'm going to try and do a two-parter today, and I hope you find this useful. Do stay tuned for the second part, and you can check us out on explaininghistory.org. Thanks very much, all the best, bye-bye.